Starting at the very beginning, who is the first character, the first person in the Bible? Usually when I ask people this in person, most of the time people shout out Adam or Adam and Eve. There is a character before them though. The first person in the Bible is actually God. Isn't it kind of funny how the whole Bible is God's story? And a lot of times at the very beginning, we sort of already forget him. We forget that he's a person, a character. We also forget that he experienced creation. It's not just something he did, it's something he lived through and that he experienced. So even before creation, God existed. And he didn't just exist numb, he existed with feelings and thoughts. He had experiences. It's hard for us to imagine God having experiences without the earth and the humans, right? But he already existed and he already had life. So in the beginning, God created. And when he created, some of the first things he created are light and life. Jesus says in John that he is the light and that he is the life. So when he created, he wasn't just creating things for the humans. This is true, that he was creating things to put Adam and Eve there and for this whole story that was going to happen. But he started with creating expressions of himself. Jesus said, I'm the light. And the first thing that God created was light. It was like he was from the very beginning, before he even put humans on earth, he was saying, this is who I am. See me, know me. The next thing he created was life in a lot of different forms. And Jesus said, I am the life. So God was creating expressions of himself in ways for him to be known from the very beginning. Then we get to, I'm going to kind of fast forward ahead through the 7 days of creation, and God creates Adam. The interesting thing about Adam, as compared to all the rest of creation, the most important thing is that he was created in the image of God. But I want to look at a couple of other things too in the actual story that we can see happening as we read that I think are significant. First of all, it says in the Bible that God formed man from the dust of the ground. So everything else he spoke into being. But with Adam, he formed him out of the dust of the ground. So this sort of signifies that he touched Adam. I don't know, it's weird because we don't really think of God as having hands until he was Jesus that came on the earth. We think of God maybe, I don't know, kind of some kind of cloud or something, more of an abstract thought. But God, I don't know if it was with hands, but he touched Adam when he created him, and he formed him, touched him. He formed him out of the earth. And with Eve, he took the rib from Adam and he touched her and created her too. So we see with Adam and Eve a far more intimate creation than with the rest of creation that he spoke into being. And then it says that he leaned over man and he breathed into man. God breathed into man and gave him life. There was already life on the earth. The plants were living, the animals were living, but man was the one that got God's breath. And you think about the intimacy involved in God being close enough to breathe into man the breath of life. So we see with Adam, and then through the rest of the humans, starting with Adam, you see a different relationship that God has with him than he does with the rest of creation. With all of creation, he looks at it and he says, it is good. But with Adam and Eve, he touches them and he breathes on them. And to me, that looks very obvious that what he wants with them is something much more intimate than with the rest of creation. We also see that he tells Adam and Eve, I have given you everything. This is one of the first things he says to Adam and Eve is, I've given you everything. And you can partake from all of it except for this one fruit. So when he says, I've given you everything, I think part of what God means there is he's saying, don't forget that this is all for me. Every good thing you have is from me. And I'm just asking you to acknowledge it, to just not forget where it came from. And he says, I've given you everything. This is the only thing I'm asking. Choose me. You can have everything I've given you. But there's this one thing that I've put in the garden, and it is an opportunity for you to reject me. So choose me. Don't choose that fruit. When Adam and Eve chose that fruit, the Bible says that they were deceived and they chose it because they wanted to be like God. They thought they would understand things, that insight that God had not given them. But beneath all of that, also they were saying, this fruit, I can have this or I can have God. I choose this. And from the first relationship God has with the humans, we see him being rejected. People say, I would rather have this than you. You have given me everything. So thanks, but no thanks on the relationship with you. I'd rather have something that you didn't give me. So how does God feel about all of this? We look at how maybe we thought about how Adam and Eve must have felt when they were kicked out of the garden, but God, what did he feel when he created the earth? He's creative, he's light and life, and he's love, and he creates everything. And then he puts the object of his love in this place, and he has a relationship with them. And the Bible doesn't give us insight into what God was thinking or feeling in the garden, but I imagine he must have been very excited as I don't know if he did it once a day or 20 times a day or what it was like when he walked with Adam and Eve in the garden. And I don't know how many years, how long that time period was, but I imagine that every day God was very excited that he got to go walk with his friends. And then one day he discovers that they had rejected him, that they had chosen something else instead of him. Now, when I say God discovered, I know that God already knows everything. He is omnipresent, which means he is everywhere, and he's omniscient, which means he knows everything. So this is a very interesting thing that we see over and over again in the Bible. God knows everything that's going to happen, past, present, or future. He is not trapped in time. He sees it all and knows it all. Before you even think it, he knows it. But here's the thing that I see over and over again in the Bible, that God, even though he knows what's going to happen, he finds a way to be fully present in the moment. So here he is. He knows the whole plan. Before he even creates Adam and Eve, he knows that they're going to reject him and that he is eventually going to send Jesus to save these people. But when you look at what God seems to be thinking and feeling from what the scriptures reveal, it doesn't seem like because of that, he's just sort of like above it all. Like he's very stoic. He knows what's going to happen, and this is just part of his plan. That is not the God that I see in the Old Testament. And if you look carefully, you will see that he reacts to things. He has an emotional reaction to what the humans do and to what is happening in his story. He lives in eternity, but he seems to experience things in time. He has the ability to be fully present. I think that is true in all of the stories of the Bible, and I think it's true in our life too. God, even though he knows what is going to happen in my life, and he knows how he is going to use my pain for good, when I am in pain, he's not thinking about how he's going to use it for good alone. He fully enters into that moment, and he feels it with the full force of the moment with me. So this God who is fully present, and he experiences the joy of creation and the intimacy of the relationship with Adam and Eve, he gets rejected. And after that story, that God is rejected and Adam and Eve are forced to leave the garden, then we see God over and over and over again experiencing that rejection, being forgotten. And I want you to keep a careful eye as you read through the whole Bible on God's story in the Bible. What is he thinking? What is he feeling? What is he experiencing? And you will see, you will find the fruits of the Spirit in the God of the Old Testament. And you will see his long suffering, his gentleness, and his kindness, and his patience, and his love over and over again. But keep in mind that he is a person that is he is being affected by what is happening in these stories. Okay, here is a brief overview of the entire Bible. We start out with God creating everything. And he creates Adam and Eve, and they fall when they get kicked out of the garden. After that, their son Cain kills their son Abel. And then the next story we see in the Bible is the flood. So already, one of the first things in the history of people is that all of the people reject God completely, and he rescues humanity through this one man, Noah, and his family by the ark. So the next thing we see is the Tower of Babel. When they get out of the ark, God says, spread out under the whole earth, and they all stay together because do not want to obey God. And so the Tower of Babel happens where God spreads them out and confuses their languages. The next thing we see happening in the Bible is in Genesis 12, and it's when God calls Abraham. So Abraham, this guy, God gives him 3 promises. The first one is, I'm going to give you all the land that you can see. So he promises this land that we refer to after that as the Promised Land, this land of Canaan, modern day Israel. The second thing he promises him is descendants. He said, your descendants will be like the stars of the sky or like the sand on the seashore. So you're going to have lots and lots of descendants. And the third thing he promises him is through your descendants, all nations of the earth will be blessed. And we see this fulfilled in Jesus. And so through the rest of the Old Testament, we read about Abraham, his family, his descendants, but it's in the New Testament when Jesus comes through Abraham's seed that all nations of the earth are blessed. So those are the 3 promises that God gives Abraham, and he repeats them to his son Isaac and Isaac's son Jacob. Abraham marries Sarah. Because Sarah is barren, eventually he also marries Hagar and they have Ishmael. God says that is not the son of promise. Later, Sarah has Isaac and he is the son of promise. And then we see in Genesis 22, Abraham taking Isaac up on a hill to sacrifice him, and God rescues Isaac by saying, no, here's a substitute, use this lamb instead. And God gives Abraham a picture of what he's going to do with his son, bring him up on a hill and have him sacrificed. And then Isaac marries Rebekah, and they have Jacob and Esau. Jacob, later his name is changed to Israel, and he has 4 wives and 12 sons. Of these 12 sons, the most important ones are Levi, Judah, and Joseph. Levi is important because through him we see the Levitical priesthood get set up, and we'll read about that more in February. Judah is important because it is through this tribe, through this son, that Jesus comes from. And the kings of Israel come from Judah through David's line. Joseph is important because it's through him that he is the one that his father gives him the coat of many colors. He is sold into slavery, and the people, all of the descendants of Jacob, which there were 70 of them at that time, they were all rescued from a severe famine in that part of the world, from all of them moving to Egypt when Joseph forgives his brothers and they all move to Egypt. So when the book of Genesis closes, all of them are in Egypt, and there's 70 of them. Later, when he blesses his 12 sons, he elevates Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Instead of being grandsons, he elevates them to the status of sons. And that's why there is not a tribe of Joseph mentioned later in the Old Testament. Instead, you see a tribe of Manasseh and a tribe of Ephraim. So that makes 13, because it's these 12 minus Joseph plus Manasseh and Ephraim. But a lot of times when they count the tribes, Levi isn't mentioned, because if they're going to count the soldiers or whatever, since he is the priestly tribe, he is often left out of the counting. And so these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what makes up Israel or Judah, or what we call the Hebrews in the Old Testament, what we call Jews or Israelites. It's made up of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then these 12 sons. So they're in Egypt, and Genesis closes, and then the book of the Bible, Exodus, starts. And when Exodus opens, they have been in oppression and in slavery in Egypt for about 400 years. Then Moses is born, and probably most of you are familiar with the story of Moses, that God rescued him from the Pharaoh killing all of the children through his mother putting him in a basket. And then later, God rescues the entire Israelite nation through bringing Moses back, and they have the plagues and the Red Sea, and the entire book of Exodus is about them exiting Egypt. The next book of the Bible is Leviticus, and Leviticus takes place during the 1 year that they spend at Mount Sinai. After they've crossed the Red Sea and they go to Mount Sinai, that is where they spend about a year, and God gives them all of the laws, and he gives them the rules for the priests, and they set up the priesthood, and he also gives them the instructions for building the tabernacle. They build their tabernacle there, and they start this formalized worship of God. They also make a deal with God at that point that they will be God's people, and God will be their God. And they basically say, God, we're going to enter into a covenant with you. And God says, if you obey us, things will go well for you. If you obey me, things will go well for you. And if you don't obey me and you break this covenant with me, then things are going to go very bad for you. And the people willingly enter into this covenant and then break it very, very quickly. So that's what Leviticus is about. In Numbers, so at the end of this year, they go to this land that God had promised to Abraham, and 10 spies go in. And of those spies, or 12 spies go in, and of those spies, 10 said that this land, we're going to just be totally killed. They're way too strong for us. And 2 say, I think we can do it. God will deliver the land into our hands. And because the people believed the 10 spies instead of the 2 spies, they ended up spending 40 more years wandering around in the desert. Numbers covers that period of time. It has some stories in it, and it tells about where they went. And also Leviticus and Numbers have a lot of the laws that God set up, about all of the laws for them as a nation, the ceremonial laws for their practice of religion and worshiping God. And then Deuteronomy, I think of Deuteronomy as kind of Moses' goodbye speech. There are, right at the beginning, some stories in there that aren't covered anywhere else, but a lot of Deuteronomy covers stuff that was already covered in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, but it's Moses kind of recounting the history of the people and reminding the people of what God had done for them and what promises they had made to God, and really pleading with the people to remember God and not forget the deal that they've made with him and the covenant that they have with him. So Deuteronomy is very similar to these books. It repeats some of those things, but I think of it as having a more emotional undertone than the earlier books, because Moses is getting ready to say goodbye and pleading with the people. So it's during the book of Numbers that we see Balaam and the talking donkey, and he blesses Israel. And then Joshua starts with them on the brink of the promised land again, and they take over Jericho by marching around the city, and they cross the Jordan, and the rest of Joshua is about them dividing up the land. When they take over Jericho, there's a woman that saves the 2 spies at that time, and her name is Rahab, and because she rescues those spies, God rescues her and her entire family. And not only does he rescue them from destruction, but because she sides with God and with his people, she ends up becoming part of the Israelite nation, and she ends up being one of the a bunch of greats, grandmother of Jesus. So Jesus is his ancestors. One of them is Rahab, this Canaanite woman who sided with God, and so that's Rahab. Then a period of time goes by during this, it's called the Judges, that's a book of the Bible, and it covers about 400 years. And during that time, Moses and Joshua have died, but they don't have kings yet. So there's no official, established king or leader leading the people. So God kind of raises up these military deliverers that there's various stories about them, that people will be oppressed for a while, and then they'll cry out to God, and he'll raise someone up that will help deliver them from someone who's oppressing them, one of the surrounding nations. And then they forget God, and they go back into oppression, and then some more time goes by, and he raises up another judge. So we'll read about those. I have a couple on the timeline that are just kind of the most important ones in terms of there's the most written about them, or they have an interesting story. One of them is a woman, Deborah. That's pretty cool. So the last judge of Israel is Samuel, and 1 Samuel talks about his life. He is more of a spiritual leader than a military leader like the other judges. And at the end of his life, the people really want a king, so he anoints the first king of Israel, which is Saul. And the book of Samuel covers Samuel's life and Saul's life up until his death. It's during this first king of Israel, Saul's life, that this boy named David, you probably have heard of him. He kills Goliath. He has the 30 mighty men, which is an awesome story. I can't wait till we get there. And he unfortunately has his friend Uriah killed and takes his wife Bathsheba. And there's so many stories about David. It's a really big chunk of the Bible that we can't possibly cover it in this brief timeline, but it will be really fun when we get there. These books of the Bible, Chronicles, Kings, and Samuel, they cover some of the same stories and overlap, which is why it's so great that we're reading it chronologically. And then a lot of the poetry from the Bible, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Songs of Solomon, were also written during these times by David and his son Solomon and some of the other men that served them in the court during that time. So these 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, are the 3 kings that are the United Kingdom of Israel, are the United Kingdom of Israel. All of Israel is under one king for these 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. After that, 10 of the tribes say, you know what, thanks but no thanks, we are going to choose our own king. And they choose a man named Jeroboam, and he becomes the king of Israel. It's the northern 10 tribes, and they are not descendants of David. They are random people. And then you still have Judah, which is following the line of David through almost all of the kings, although sometimes there's a brother or a grandmother. But most of these are from the line of David, and they lead right to Jesus. And so these are Judah and Benjamin. Those tribes stay together. And from here on in the Bible, when the Bible talks about Judah, it's not just talking about the tribe of Judah. It's talking about this nation of Judah that is made up of Judah and Benjamin. And when it talks about Israel, it's not talking about all 12 tribes of Israel. From this point on, Israel is referring to the northern 10 tribes and this nation. So they're two different nations. Sometimes they're working together and they are allies, and at other times during this history, they are enemies and they're at war against each other. But you have a whole bunch of kings. Most of them are bad. Some of them are good. And during that time, these prophets, like Joel and Obadiah and Micah and Isaiah, these prophets start prophesying things about, remember the covenant that you made with God at Mount Sinai. If you turn to God, even though you've rejected him and betrayed him and disobeyed him for years, if you turn back towards him, he will turn back towards you. He'll give you another chance and another chance and another chance. And but if you continue to disobey him and make a mockery of his name to the other nations, then you are going to lose your nation and be sent into exile and into captivity, where perhaps God can pursue you and you will finally return to him. So these prophets, when you read the Bible straight through, you read the history books, the poetry books, and then the prophetic books. But some of these prophets, they all prophesied during one of these kings. And so when you read it chronologically, you'll see what was going on in Jerusalem or in Samaria when they were prophesying, and you'll see which king they were talking to. So it's really helpful when you read through it that way. So in 722 BC, Assyria completely wipes out Israel. They deport some of them and they become exiles. They kill a lot of them and they lose all power, all autonomy, and are pretty much destroyed as a nation. Then, some more years go by, and in 587 BC, the southern tribe goes into captivity to Babylon, which is the world power at that time. So at this point, that Israel and Judah, they are in captivity. They don't have a king. They are waiting for God to deliver them and bring them back to the promised land. So Daniel comes along, and he is at this time in Babylon as one of the exiles, but he ends up getting promoted and being kind of a leader in Babylon. At the same time, Ezekiel is prophesying to the kind of poor refugee exiles, and at that same time, Jeremiah is prophesying to the people that were still left in Jerusalem, and then even after Jerusalem was destroyed, he was prophesying to the people the poor people, the few people who were left in the land. So then during this time, Babylon is in power. Eventually, the Persian Empire starts with Daniel interprets the writing on the wall, and that night the Persian Empire takes over the Babylonian Empire, and they are in power. So during that, we have a few stories like Daniel in the lion's den, and shortly after that, actually in 538 BC, Cyrus lets Ezra and Zerubbabel take 50,000 people back to Jerusalem, and they start rebuilding the temple. A little bit later, Nehemiah takes some people back to Jerusalem, and they rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. During that time also, Esther is queen in the Persian Empire, and she saves the entire Jewish people from being completely wiped out due to evil Haman's plan. So when the Old Testament ends, there are people living in Jerusalem. They have walls, they have a temple, but once again, they have no king or no autonomy. They're under the Persian Empire. Between the Old Testament and the New Testament, Greece comes to power, and then Rome comes to power. And during that time, Israel goes through a lot of conflict, and we'll talk about that when we get to that point, this 500-year period of time between the Old and the New. In the New Testament, Jesus is born. Most of these four books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are made up of Jesus' teachings, his parables, his miracles, and just kind of his life. And then we see he chooses the 12 disciples, and Acts is about how the church forms and kind of the early church. And Acts covers the period of time that most of these books are written. So these books, most of the rest of the books in the New Testament are letters when the church is first getting formed that various authors write to the church to let them know what it means to be a Christian and a Christ follower. And they, like I said, they take place at the same period of time as Acts, which is kind of the story of the start of the church. So the most important part of the story of the Bible is that God became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus died and he rose again so that we could be rescued from our sin, so that we could be reconciled to God. If this is something you don't understand or would like to have a conversation about, please feel free to reach out to me at wkimandjoe@hotmail.com. In January, you're going to be reading the entire book of Genesis and the entire book of Job. We already talked about Genesis in the overview of the entire Bible. Job is a story about suffering, and it's a story about 3 friends that give foolish advice and accuse Job of suffering because of his sin. And Job doesn't believe that accusation. And then at the end of the story, God shows up and gives his opinion about suffering and about Job. So I hope you enjoyed Genesis and Job, and I will talk to you again at the end of January. Thanks for going on this journey with me.